Chapter 59 of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 59. Esther's Narrative.
It was 3 o'clock in the morning when the houses outside London did at last begin to exclude the country and to close us in with streets. We had made our way along roads in far worse condition than when we had traversed them by daylight, both the fall and the thaw having lasted ever since. But the energy of my companion never slackened. It had only been, as I thought, of less assistance than the horses in getting us on, and it had often aided them. They had stopped exhausted half-way up hills. They had been driven through streams of turbulent water. They had slipped down and become entangled with the harness. But he and his little lantern had been always ready, and when the mishap was set right, I never heard any variation in his cool, "Get on, my lads." The steadiness and confidence with which he had directed our journey back I could not account for. Never wavering, he never even stopped to make an inquiry until we were within a few miles of London. A very few words, here and there, were then enough for him, and thus we came, at between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, into Islington. I will not dwell on the suspense and anxiety with which I reflected all this time that we were leaving my mother farther and farther behind every minute. I think I had some strong hope that he must be right and could not fail to have a satisfactory object in following this woman, but I tormented myself with questioning it and discussing it during the whole journey. What was to ensue when we found her, and what could compensate us for this loss of time, were questions also that I could not possibly dismiss. My mind was quite tortured by long dwelling on such reflections when we stopped. We stopped in a high street where there was a coach stand. My companion paid our 2 drivers, who were as completely covered with splashes as if they had been dragged along the roads like the carriage itself, and giving them some brief direction where to take it, lifted me out of it and into a hackney coach he had chosen from the rest.
"Why, my dear," he said as he did this, "how wet you are!"
I had not been conscious of it, but the melted snow had found its way into the carriage, and I had got out 2 or 3 times when a fallen horse was plunging and had to be got up, and the wet had penetrated my dress. I assured him it was no matter, but the driver, who knew him, would not be dissuaded by me from running down the street to his stable, whence he brought an armful of clean dry straw. They shook it out and strewed it well about me, and I found it warm and comfortable.
"Now, my dear,"
said Mr. Bucket, with his head in at the window after I was shut up,
"we're a-going to mark this person down. It may take a little time, but you don't mind that. You're pretty sure that I've got a motive, ain't you?"
I little thought what it was, little thought in how short a time I should understand it better, but I assured him that I had confidence in him.
"So you may have, my dear,"
he returned.
"And I tell you what, if you only repose half as much confidence in me as I repose in you after what I've experienced of you, that'll do. Lord, you're no trouble at all. I never see a young woman in any station of society, and I've seen many elevated ones too, conduct herself like you have conducted yourself since you was out of your bed. You're a pattern, you know. That's what you are," said Mr. Bucket warmly. "You're a pattern." I told him I was very glad, as indeed I was, to have been no hindrance to him, and that I hoped I should be none now. "My dear,"
he returned,
"when a young lady is as mild as she's game, and as game as she's mild, that's all I ask, and more than I expect. She then becomes a queen, and that's about what you are yourself."
With these encouraging words, they really were encouraging to me under those lonely and anxious circumstances, he got upon the box, and we once more drove away. Where we drove, I neither knew then nor have ever known since, but we appeared to seek out the narrowest and worst streets in London. Whenever I saw him directing the driver, I was prepared for our descending into a deeper complication of such streets, and we never failed to do so. Sometimes we emerged upon a wider thoroughfare or came to a larger building than the generality, well lighted. Then we stopped at offices like those we had visited when we began our journey, and I saw him in consultation with others. Sometimes he would get down by an archway or at a street corner and mysteriously show the light of his little lantern. This would attract similar lights from various dark quarters, like so many insects, and a fresh consultation would be held. By degrees we appeared to contract our search within narrower and easier limits. Single police officers on duty could now tell Mr. Bucket what he wanted to know and point to him where to go. At last we stopped for a rather long conversation between him and one of these men, which I supposed to be satisfactory from his manner of nodding from time to time. When it was finished, he came to me, looking very busy and very attentive.
"Now, Miss Summerson," he said to me, "you won't be alarmed, whatever comes off, I know. It's not necessary for me to give you any further caution and to tell you that we have marked this person down, and that you may be of use to me before I know it myself. I don't like to ask such a thing, my dear, but would you walk a little way?" Of course I got out directly and took his arm. "It ain't so easy to keep your feet," said Mr. Bucket, "but take time." Although I looked about me confusedly and hurriedly as we crossed the street, I thought I knew the place. "Are we in Holborn?" I asked him. "Yes,"
said Mr. Bucket.
"Do you know this turning?"
"It looks like Chancery Lane."
"And was christened so, my dear,"
said Mr. Bucket. We turned down it, and as we went shuffling through the sleet, I heard the clocks strike 5:30. We passed on in silence and as quickly as we could, with such a foothold, when some one coming towards us on the narrow pavement, wrapped in a cloak, stopped and stood aside to give me room. In the same moment I heard an exclamation of wonder, and my own name from Mr. Woodcourt. I knew his voice very well. It was so unexpected and so, I don't know what to call it, whether pleasant or painful, to come upon it after my feverish wandering journey, and in the midst of the night, that I could not keep back the tears from my eyes. It was like hearing his voice in a strange country.
"My dear Miss Summerson, that you should be out at this hour and in such weather!"
He had heard from my guardian of my having been called away on some uncommon business and said so to dispense with any explanation. I told him that we had but just left a coach and were going, but then I was obliged to look at my companion.
"Why, you see, Mr. Woodcourt,"
he had caught the name from me,
"we are a-going at present into the next street. Inspector Bucket."
Mr. Woodcourt, disregarding my remonstrances, had hurriedly taken off his cloak and was putting it about me.
"That's a good move too,"
said Mr. Bucket, assisting.
"A very good move." "May I go with you?"
said Mr. Woodcourt. I don't know whether to me or to my companion.
"Why, Lord!"
exclaimed Mr. Bucket, taking the answer on himself.
"Of course you may."
It was all said in a moment, and they took me between them, wrapped in the cloak.
"I have just left Richard,"
said Mr. Woodcourt.
"I have been sitting with him since 10 o'clock last night."
"Oh, dear me! He is ill?"
"No, no, believe me, not ill, but not quite well. He was depressed and faint. You know he gets so worried and so worn sometimes, and Ada sent to me, of course. And when I came home, I found her note and came straight here. Well, Richard revived so much after a little while, and Ada was so happy and so convinced of its being my doing, though God knows I had little enough to do with it, that I remained with him until he had been fast asleep some hours. As fast asleep as she is now, I hope."
His friendly and familiar way of speaking of them, his unaffected devotion to them, the grateful confidence with which I knew he had inspired my darling, and the comfort he was to her, could I separate all this from his promise to me? How thankless I must have been if it had not recalled the words he said to me when he was so moved by the change in my appearance. I will accept him as a trust, and it shall be a sacred one. We now turned into another narrow street.
"Mr. Woodcourt,"
said Mr. Bucket, who had eyed him closely as we came along,
"our business takes us to a law stationer's here, a certain Mr. Snagsby. What? You know him, do you?"
He was so quick that he saw it in an instant.
"Yes, I know a little of him and have called upon him at this place." "Indeed, sir?"
said Mr. Bucket.
"Then you will be so good as to let me leave Miss Summerson with you for a moment while I go and have half a word with him."
The last police officer with whom he had conferred was standing silently behind us. I was not aware of it until he struck in on my saying I heard some one crying.
"Don't be alarmed, miss," he cried. "It's Snagsby's servant." "Why, you see,"
said Mr. Bucket,
"the girl's subject to fits, and has 'em bad upon her to-night. A most contrary circumstance it is, for I want certain information out of that girl, and she must be brought to reason somehow. At all events, they wouldn't be up yet if it wasn't for her, Mr. Bucket," said the other man. "She's been at it pretty well all night, sir." "Well, that's true," he returned. "My light's burnt out. Show yours a minute."
All this passed in a whisper a door or two from the house in which I could faintly hear crying and moaning. In the little round of light produced for the purpose, Mr. Bucket went up to the door and knocked. The door was opened after he had knocked twice, and he went in, leaving us standing in the street.
"Miss Summerson,"
said Mr. Woodcourt,
"if, without obtruding myself on your confidence, I may remain near you, pray let me do so."
"You are truly kind," I answered. "I need wish to keep no secret of my own from you. If I keep any, it is another's."
"I quite understand. Trust me, I will remain near you only so long as I can fully respect it."
"I trust implicitly to you," I said. "I know and deeply feel how sacredly you keep your promise." After a short time, the little round of light shone out again, and Mr. Bucket advanced towards us in it with his earnest face.
"Please to come in, Miss Summerson,"
he said,
"and sit down by the fire. Mr. Woodcourt, from information I have received, I understand you are a medical man. Would you look to this girl and see if anything can be done to bring her round? She has a letter somewhere that I particularly want. It's not in her box, and I think it must be about her, but she's so twisted and clenched up that she is difficult to handle without hurting." We all three went into the house together. Although it was cold and raw, it smelt close too from being up all night. In the passage behind the door stood a scared, sorrowful-looking little man in a grey coat, who seemed to have a naturally polite manner and spoke meekly.
"Downstairs, if you please, Mr. Bucket," said he. "The lady will excuse the front kitchen. We use it as our workaday sitting-room. The back is Guster's bedroom, and in it she's a-carrying on, poor thing, to a frightful extent."
We went downstairs, followed by Mr. Snagsby, as I soon found the little man to be. In the front kitchen, sitting by the fire, was Mrs. Snagsby, with very red eyes and a very severe expression of face.
"My little woman,"
said Mr. Snagsby, entering behind us,
"to waive, not to put too fine a point upon it, my dear, hostilities for one single moment in the course of this prolonged night, here is Inspector Bucket, Mr. Woodcourt, and a lady."
She looked very much astonished, as she had reason for doing, and looked particularly hard at me.
"My little woman,"
said Mr. Snagsby, sitting down in the remotest corner by the door, as if he were taking a liberty,
"it is not unlikely that you may inquire of me why Inspector Bucket, Mr. Woodcourt, and a lady call upon us in Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, at the present hour. I don't know. I have not the least idea. If I was to be informed, I should despair of understanding, and I'd rather not be told." He appeared so miserable, sitting with his head upon his hand, and I appeared so unwelcome that I was going to offer an apology when Mr. Bucket took the matter on himself.
"Now, Mr. Snagsby,"
said he,
"the best thing you can do is to go along with Mr. Woodcourt to look after your Guster."
"My Guster, Mr. Bucket!"
cried Mr. Snagsby.
"Go on, sir, go on. I shall be charged with that next."
"And to hold the candle,"
pursued Mr. Bucket, without correcting himself,
"or hold her, or make yourself useful in any way you're asked. Which there's not a man alive more ready to do, for you're a man of urbanity and suavity, you know, and you've got the sort of heart that can feel for another. Mr. Woodcourt, would you be so good as to see to her, and if you can get that letter from her, to let me have it as soon as ever you can?"
As they went out, Mr. Bucket made me sit down in a corner by the fire and take off my wet shoes, which he turned up to dry upon the fender, talking all the time.
"Don't you be at all put out, miss, by the want of a hospitable look from Mrs. Snagsby there, because she's under a mistake altogether. She'll find that out sooner than will be agreeable to a lady of her generally correct manner of forming her thoughts, because I'm a-going to explain it to her."
Here, standing on the hearth, with his wet hat and shawls in his hand, himself a pile of wet, he turned to Mrs. Snagsby.
"Now, the first thing that I say to you, as a married woman, possessing what you may call charms, you know, believe me, if all those endearing, and etc., you're well acquainted with the song, because it's in vain for you to tell me that you and good society are strangers. Charms, attractions, mind you, that ought to give you confidence in yourself, is that you've done it."
Mrs. Snagsby looked rather alarmed, relented a little, and faltered, "What did Mr. Bucket mean?"
"What does Mr. Bucket mean?"
he repeated, and I saw by his face that all the time he talked he was listening for the discovery of the letter, to my own great agitation, for I knew then how important it must be.
"I'll tell you what he means, ma'am. Go and see Othello acted. That's the tragedy for you."
Mrs. Snagsby consciously asked why.
"Why?"
said Mr. Bucket.
"Because you'll come to that if you don't look out. Why, at the very moment while I speak, I know what your mind's not wholly free from respecting this young lady. But shall I tell you who this young lady is? Now, come, you're what I call an intellectual woman, with your soul too large for your body, if you come to that, and chafing it, and you know me, and you recollect where you saw me last, and what was talked of in that circle, don't you? Yes. Very well. This young lady is that young lady."
Mrs. Snagsby appeared to understand the reference better than I did at the time.
"And Tuffy, him as you call Joe, was mixed up in the same business, and no other. And the law writer that you know of was mixed up in the same business, and no other. And your husband, with no more knowledge of it than your great-grandfather, was mixed up by Mr. Tulkinghorn, deceased, his best customer, in the same business, and no other. And the whole biling of people was mixed up in the same business, and no other. And yet a married woman, possessing your attractions, shuts her eyes, and sparklers too, and goes and runs her delicate-formed head against a wall. Why, I'm ashamed of you. I expected Mr. Woodcourt might have got it by this time."
Mrs. Snagsby shook her head and put her handkerchief to her eyes.
"Is that all?"
said Mr. Bucket excitedly.
"No. See what happens. Another person mixed up in that business and no other. A person in a wretched state comes here to-night and is seen a-speaking to your maidservant, and between her and your maidservant there passes a paper that I would give £100 for down. What do? You hide and you watch 'em, and you pounce upon that maidservant, knowing what she's subject to and what a little thing will bring 'em on, in that surprising manner and with that severity that, by the Lord, she goes off and keeps off, when her life may be hanging upon that girl's words."
He so thoroughly meant what he said now, that I involuntarily clasped my hands and felt the room turning away from me. But it stopped. Mr. Woodcourt came in, put a paper into his hand, and went away again.
"Now, Mrs. Snagsby, the only amends you can make,"
said Mr. Bucket, rapidly glancing at it,
"is to let me speak a word to this young lady in private here. And if you know of any help you can give to that gentleman in the next kitchen there, or can think of any one thing that's likelier than another to bring the girl round, do your swiftest and best."
In an instant she was gone, and he had shut the door.
"Now, my dear, you're steady and quite sure of yourself?"
"Quite," said I.
"Whose writing is that?"
It was my mother's. A pencil writing, on a crushed and torn piece of paper, blotted with wet, folded roughly like a letter, and directed to me at my guardian's.
"You know the hand,"
he said,
"and if you're firm enough to read it to me, do. But be particular to a word."
It had been written in portions, at different times. I read what follows. I came to the cottage with two objects. First, to see the dear one, if I could, once more, but only to see her, not to speak to her or let her know that I was near. The other object, to elude pursuit and to be lost. Do not blame the mother for her share. The assistance that she rendered me, she rendered on my strongest assurance that it was for the dear one's good. You remember her dead child? The men's consent I bought, but her help was freely given.
"I came, that was written,"
said my companion,
"when she rested there. It bears out what I made of it. I was right."
The next was written at another time. I have wandered a long distance, and for many hours, and I know that I must soon die. These streets, I have no purpose but to die. When I left, I had a worse, but I am saved from adding that guilt to the rest. Cold, wet, and fatigue are sufficient causes for my being found dead, but I shall die of others, though I suffer from these. It was right that all that had sustained me should give way at once, and that I should die of terror and my conscience.
"Take courage,"
said Mr. Bucket.
"There's only a few words more."
Those, too, were written at another time, to all appearance almost in the dark. I have done all I could do to be lost. I shall be soon forgotten so, and shall disgrace him least. I have nothing about me by which I can be recognized. This paper I part with now. The place where I shall lie down, if I can get so far, has been often in my mind. Farewell. Forgive. Mr. Bucket, supporting me with his arm, lowered me gently into my chair.
"Cheer up. Don't think me hard with you, my dear, but as soon as ever you feel equal to it, get your shoes on and be ready."
I did as he required, but I was left there a long time, praying for my unhappy mother. They were all occupied with the poor girl, and I heard Mr. Woodcourt directing them and speaking to her often. At length he came in with Mr. Bucket, and said that, as it was important to address her gently, he thought it best that I should ask her for whatever information we desired to obtain. There was no doubt that she could now reply to questions if she were soothed and not alarmed. The questions, Mr. Bucket said, were how she came by the letter, what passed between her and the person who gave her the letter, and where the person went. Holding my mind as steadily as I could to these points, I went into the next room with them. Mr. Woodcourt would have remained outside, but at my solicitation went in with us. The poor girl was sitting on the floor where they had laid her down. They stood around her, though at a little distance, that she might have air. She was not pretty, and looked weak and poor, but she had a plaintive and a good face, though it was still a little wild. I kneeled on the ground beside her and put her poor head upon my shoulder, whereupon she drew her arm round my neck and burst into tears. "My poor girl," said I, laying my face against her forehead, for indeed I was crying too, and trembling. "It seems cruel to trouble you now, but more depends on our knowing something about this letter than I could tell you in an hour." She began piteously declaring that she didn't mean any harm. She didn't mean any harm, Mrs. Snagsby. "We are all sure of that," said I. "But pray tell me how you got it." "Yes, dear lady, I will, and tell you true. I'll tell true indeed, Mrs. Snagsby." "I am sure of that," said I. "And how was it?" "I had been out on an errand, dear lady, long after it was dark, quite late, and when I came home I found a common-looking person, all wet and muddy, looking up at our house. When she saw me coming in at the door, she called me back and said did I live here, and I said yes, and she said she knew only one or two places about here, but had lost her way and couldn't find him. Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do? They won't believe me. She didn't say any harm to me. I didn't say any harm to her, indeed, Mrs. Snagsby." It was necessary for her mistress to comfort her, which she did, I must say, with a good deal of contrition, before she could be got beyond this. "She could not find those places," said I. "No," cried the girl, shaking her head. "No, couldn't find 'em. And she was so faint and lame and miserable, oh, so wretched, that if you'd seen her, Mr. Snagsby, you'd have given her half a crown, I know." "Well, Guster, my girl," said he, at first not knowing what to say, "I hope I should." "And yet she was so well spoken," said the girl, looking at me with wide open eyes, "that he made a person's heart bleed. And so she said to me, did I know the way to the burying ground? And I asked her, which burying ground? And she said, the poor burying ground. And so I told her I had been a poor child myself, and it was according to parishes. But she said she meant a poor burying ground not very far from here, where there was an archway, and a step, and an iron gate." As I watched her face, and soothed her to go on, I saw that Mr. Bucket received this with a look which I could not separate from one of alarm. "Oh, dear, dear!" cried the girl, pressing her hair back with her hands. "What shall I do? What shall I do? She meant the burying ground where the man was buried that took the sleeping stuff that you came home and told us of, Mr. Snagsby. That frightened me so, Mrs. Snagsby. Oh, I am frightened again. Hold me." "You are so much better now," said I. Pray tell me more." "Yes, I will. Yes, I will. But don't be angry with me, as a dear lady, because I've been so ill." "Angry with her? Poor soul!" "There! Now I will. Now I will. So she said, could I tell her how to find it? And I said yes, and I told her. And she looked at me with eyes like almost as if she was blind,
and herself all waving back. And so she took out the letter and showed it me, and said if she was to put that in the post-office it would be rubbed out and not minded and never sent, and would I take it from her and send it, and the messenger would be paid at the house. And so I said yes, if it was no harm, and she said no harm, and so I took it from her, and she said she had nothing to give me, and I said I was poor myself, and consequently wanted nothing, and so she said, God bless you, and went.
And did she go?
Yes,
cried the girl, anticipating the inquiry.
yes, she went the way I'd shown her. Then I came in, and Mrs. Snagsby came behind me from somewhere and laid hold of me, and I was frightened.
Mr. Woodcourt took her kindly from me. Mr. Bucket wrapped me up, and immediately we were in the street. Mr. Woodcourt hesitated, but I said, Don't leave me now. And Mr. Bucket added,
You'll be better with us. We may want you. Don't lose time.
I have the most confused impressions of that walk. I recollect that it was neither night nor day, that morning was dawning but the street lamps were not yet put out, that the sleet was still falling, and that all the ways were deep with it. I recollect a few chilled people passing in the streets. I recollect the wet housetops, the clogged and bursting gutters and waterspouts, the mounds of blackened ice and snow over which we passed, the narrowness of the courts by which we went. At the same time, I remember that the poor girl seemed to be yet telling her story audibly and plainly in my hearing, that I could feel her resting on my arm, that the stained house fronts put on human shapes and looked at me, that great water gates seemed to be opening and closing in my head or in the air, and that the unreal things were more substantial than the real. At last we stood under a dark and miserable covered way, where one lamp was burning over an iron gate, and where the morning faintly struggled in. The gate was closed. Beyond it was a burial ground, a dreadful spot, in which the night was very slowly stirring, but where I could dimly see heaps of dishonoured graves and stones, hemmed in by filthy houses, with a few dull lights in their windows, and on whose walls a thick humidity broke out like a disease. On the step at the gate, drenched in the fearful wet of such a place, which oozed and splashed down everywhere, I saw, with a cry of pity and horror, a woman lying, Jenny, the mother of the dead child. I ran forward, but they stopped me, and Mr. Woodcourt entreated me, with the greatest earnestness, even with tears, before I went up to the figure, to listen for an instant to what Mr. Bucket said. I did so, as I thought. I did so, as I am sure.
Miss Summerson, you'll understand me if you think a moment. They changed clothes at the cottage.
They changed clothes at the cottage. I could repeat the words in my mind, and I knew what they meant of themselves, but I attached no meaning to them in any other connection.
And one returned,
said Mr. Bucket.
And one went on. And the one that went on only went on a certain way agreed upon to deceive, and then turned across country and went home. Think a moment.
I could repeat this in my mind too, but I had not the least idea what it meant. I saw before me lying on the step the mother of the dead child. She lay there with one arm creeping round a bar of the iron gate, and seeming to embrace it. She lay there, who had so lately spoken to my mother. She lay there, a distressed, unsheltered, senseless creature. She who had brought my mother's letter, who could give me the only clue to where my mother was. She who was to guide us to rescue and save her, whom we had sought so far, who had come to this condition by some means connected with my mother that I could not follow, and might be passing beyond our reach and help at that moment. She lay there, and they stopped me. I saw, but did not comprehend, the solemn and compassionate look in Mr. Woodcourt's face. I saw, but did not comprehend his touching the other on the breast to keep him back. I saw him stand uncovered in the bitter air, with a reverence for something, but my understanding for all this was gone. I even heard it said between them, "Shall she go?"
She had better go. Her hands should be the first to touch her. They have a higher right than ours.
I passed on to the gate and stooped down. I lifted the heavy head, put the long dank hair aside, and turned the face. And it was my mother, cold and dead.
End of chapter 59. Chapter 60 of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Chapter 60. Perspective.
I proceed to other passages of my narrative. From the goodness of all about me I derived such consolation as I can never think of unmoved. I have already said so much of myself, and so much still remains, that I will not dwell upon my sorrow. I had an illness, but it was not a long one, and I would avoid even this mention of it if I could quite keep down the recollection of their sympathy. I proceed to other passages of my narrative. During the time of my illness we were still in London, where Mrs. Woodcourt had come, on my guardian's invitation, to stay with us. When my guardian thought me well and cheerful enough to talk with him in our old way, though I could have done that sooner if he would have believed me, I resumed my work and my chair beside his. He had appointed the time himself, and we were alone.
"Dame Trot,"
said he, receiving me with a kiss,
"welcome to the growlery again, my dear. I have a scheme to develop, little woman. I propose to remain here, perhaps for 6 months, perhaps for a longer time, as it may be. Quite to settle here for a while, in short."
"And in the meanwhile leave Bleak House?" said I.
"Aye, aye, my dear, Bleak House," he returned, "must learn to take care of itself."
I thought his tone sounded sorrowful, but looking at him I saw his kind face lighted up by its pleasantest smile.
"Bleak House,"
he repeated, and his tone did not sound sorrowful, I found.
"Must learn to take care of itself. It is a long way from Ada, my dear, and Ada stands much in need of you."
"It's like you, guardian," said I, "to have been taking that into consideration for a happy surprise to both of us."
"Not so disinterested either, my dear, if you mean to extol me for that virtue, since if you were generally on the road you could be seldom with me. And besides, I wish to hear as much and as often of Ada as I can in this condition of estrangement from poor Rick. Not of her alone, but of him too, poor fellow."
"Have you seen Mr. Woodcourt this morning, guardian?"
"I see Mr. Woodcourt every morning, Dame Durden."
"Does he still say the same of Richard?"
"Just the same. He knows of no direct bodily illness that he has. On the contrary, he believes that he has none. Yet he is not easy about him. Who can be?"
My dear girl had been to see us lately every day, sometimes twice in a day. But we had foreseen all along that this would only last until I was quite myself. We knew full well that her fervent heart was as full of affection and gratitude towards her cousin John as it had ever been, and we acquitted Richard of laying any injunctions upon her to stay away. But we knew on the other hand that she felt it a part of her duty to him to be sparing of her visits at our house. My guardian's delicacy had soon perceived this and had tried to convey to her that he thought she was right. "Dear, unfortunate, mistaken Richard," said I, "when will he awake from this delusion?"
"He is not in the way to do so now, my dear,"
replied my guardian.
"The more he suffers, the more averse he will be to me. having made me the principal representative of the great occasion of his suffering."
I could not help adding, "so unreasonably."
"Ah, Dame Trot, Dame Trot,"
returned my guardian,
"what shall we find reasonable in Jarndyce and Jarndyce? Unreason and injustice at the top, unreason and injustice at the heart and at the bottom, unreason and injustice from beginning to end, if it ever has an end. How should poor Rick, always hovering near it, pluck reason out of it? He no more gathers grapes from thorns or figs from thistles than older men did in old times."
His gentleness and consideration for Richard, whenever he spoke of him, touched me so that I was always silent on this subject very soon.
"I suppose the Lord Chancellor and the Vice Chancellors and the whole Chancery battery of great guns would be infinitely astonished by such unreason and injustice in one of their suitors,"
pursued my guardian,
"when those learned gentlemen begin to raise moss-roses from the powder they sow in their wigs. I shall begin to be astonished too."
He checked himself in glancing towards the window to look where the wind was, and leaned on the back of my chair instead.
"Well, well, little woman. To go on, my dear. This rock we must leave to time, chance, and hopeful circumstances. We must not shipwreck Ada upon it. She cannot afford, and he cannot afford, the remotest chance of another separation from a friend. Therefore I have particularly begged of Woodcourt, and I now particularly beg of you, my dear, not to move this subject with Rick. Let it rest. Next week, next month, next year, sooner or later, he will see me with clearer eyes. I can wait."
But I had already discussed it with him, I confessed, and so, I thought, had Mr. Woodcourt.
"So he tells me,"
returned my guardian.
"Very good. He has made his protest, and Dame Durden has made hers, and there is nothing more to be said about it. Now I come to Mrs. Woodcourt. How do you like her, my dear?"
In answer to this question, which was oddly abrupt, I said I liked her very much and thought she was more agreeable than she used to be.
"I think so too,"
said my guardian.
"Less pedigree. Not so much of Morgan what's his name?"
That was what I meant, I acknowledged, though he was a very harmless person even when we had had more of him.
"Still, upon the whole, he is as well in his native mountains," said my guardian. "I agree with you. Then, little woman, can I do better for a time than retain Mrs. Woodcourt here?"
"No, and yet—" My guardian looked at me, waiting for what I had to say. I had nothing to say. At least I had nothing in my mind that I could say. I had an undefined impression that it might have been better if we had had some other inmate, but I could hardly have explained why, even to myself, or, if to myself, certainly not to anybody else.
"You see," said my guardian, "our neighbourhood is in Woodcourt's way, and he could come here to see her as often as he likes, which is agreeable to them both, and she is familiar to us and fond of you."
Yes, that was undeniable. I had nothing to say against it. I could not have suggested a better arrangement, but I was not quite easy in my mind. "Esther, Esther, why not? Esther, think!" "It is a very good plan indeed, dear guardian, and we could not do better."
"Sure, little woman?"
"Quite sure." I had had a moment's time to think since I had urged that duty on myself, and I was quite sure.
"Good," said my guardian. "It shall be done. Carried unanimously."
"Carried unanimously," I repeated, going on with my work. It was a cover for his book table that I happened to be ornamenting. It had been laid by on the night preceding my sad journey and never resumed. I showed it to him now, and he admired it highly. After I had explained the pattern to him and all the great effects that were to come out by and by, I thought I would go back to our last theme. "You said, dear guardian, when we spoke of Mr. Woodcourt before Ada left us, that you thought he would give a long trial to another country. Have you been advising him since?"
"Yes, little woman, pretty often."
"Has he decided to do so?"
"I rather think not."
"Some other prospect is open to him, perhaps?" said I.
"Why, yes, perhaps,"
returned my guardian, beginning his answer in a very deliberate manner.
"About half a year hence or so, there is a medical attendant for the poor to be appointed at a certain place in Yorkshire. It is a thriving place, pleasantly situated, streams and streets, town and country, mill and moor, and seems to present an opening for such a man. I mean a man whose hopes and aims may sometimes lie, as most men's sometimes do, I dare say, above the ordinary level, but to whom the ordinary level will be high enough, after all, if it should prove to be a way of usefulness and good service, leading to no other. All generous spirits are ambitious, I suppose, but the ambition that calmly trusts itself to such a road instead of spasmodically trying to fly over it is the kind I care for. It is Woodcourt's kind."
"And will he get this appointment?" I asked.
"Why, little woman,"
returned my guardian, smiling,
"not being an oracle, I cannot confidently say, but I think so. His reputation stands very high. There were people from that part of the country in the shipwreck, and strange to say, I believe the best man has the best chance. You must not suppose it to be a fine endowment. It is a very, very commonplace affair, my dear, an appointment to a great amount of work and a small amount of pay. But better things will gather about it, it may be fairly hoped."
"The poor of that place will have reason to bless the choice if it falls on Mr. Woodcourt, guardian."
"You are right, little woman. That I am sure they will."
We said no more about it, nor did he say a word about the future of Bleak House. But it was the first time I had taken my seat at his side in my mourning dress, and that accounted for it, I considered. I now began to visit my dear girl every day in the dull dark corner where she lived. The morning was my usual time, but whenever I found I had an hour or so to spare, I put on my bonnet and bustled off to Chancery Lane. They were both so glad to see me at all hours, and used to brighten up so when they heard me opening the door and coming in. Being quite at home, I never knocked, that I had no fear of becoming troublesome just yet. On these occasions I frequently found Richard absent. At other times he would be writing or reading papers in the cause at that table of his, so covered with papers, which was never disturbed. Sometimes I would come upon him lingering at the door of Mr. Vholes's office. Sometimes I would meet him in the neighbourhood, lounging about and biting his nails. I often met him wandering in Lincoln's Inn, near the place where I had first seen him. Oh, how different, how different! That the money Ada brought him was melting away with the candles I used to see burning after dark in Mr. Vholes's office, I knew very well. It was not a large amount in the beginning. He had married in debt, and I could not fail to understand by this time what was meant by Mr. Vholes's shoulder being at the wheel, as I still heard it was. My dear made the best of housekeepers and tried hard to save, but I knew that they were getting poorer and poorer every day. She shone in the miserable corner like a beautiful star. She adorned and graced it so that it became another place. Paler than she had been at home, and a little quieter than I had thought natural when she was yet so cheerful and hopeful, her face was so unshadowed that I half believed she was blinded by her love for Richard to his ruinous career. I went one day to dine with them while I was under this impression. As I turned into Symond's Inn, I met little Miss Flite coming out. She had been to make a stately call upon the wards in Jarndyce, as she still called them, and had derived the highest gratification from that ceremony. Ada had already told me that she called every Monday at 5 o'clock, with one little extra white bow in her bonnet, which never appeared there at any other time, and with her largest reticule of documents on her arm.
"My dear," she began, "so delighted. How do you do? So glad to see you. And you are going to visit our interesting Jarndyce wards. To be sure. Our beauty is at home, my dear, and will be charmed to see you."
"Then Richard is not come in yet," said I. "I am glad of that, for I was afraid of being a little late."
"No, he is not come in," returned Miss Flite. "He has had a long day in court. I left him there with Vholes. You don't like Vholes, I hope? Don't like Vholes. Dangerous man."
"I am afraid you see Richard oftener than ever now," said I.
"My dearest," returned Miss Flite, "daily and hourly. You know what I told you of the attraction on the Chancellor's table? My dear, next to myself, he is the most constant suitor in court. He begins quite to amuse our little party. Very friendly little party, are we not?"
It was miserable to hear this from her poor mad lips, though it was no surprise.
"In short, my valued friend," pursued Miss Flite, advancing her lips to my ear with an air of equal patronage and mystery, "I must tell you a secret. I have made him my executor, nominated, constituted, and appointed him in my will. Yes."
"Indeed?" said I.
"Yes,"
repeated Miss Flite in her most genteel accents.
"My executor, administrator, and assign are Chancery phrases, my love. I have reflected that if I should wear out, he will be able to watch that judgment, being so very regular in his attendance."
It made me sigh to think of him.
"I did at one time mean,"
said Miss Flite, echoing the sigh,
"to nominate, constitute, and appoint poor Gridley. Also very regular, my charming girl. I assure you, most exemplary. But he wore out, poor man. So I have appointed his successor. Don't mention it. This is in confidence."
She carefully opened her reticule a little way and showed me a folded piece of paper inside as the appointment of which she spoke.
"Another secret, my dear, I have added to my collection of birds."
"Really, Miss Flite?" said I, knowing how it pleased her to have her confidence received with an appearance of interest. She nodded several times, and her face became overcast and gloomy.
"Two more. I call them the wards in Jarndyce. They are caged up with all the others, with hope, joy, youth, peace, rest, life, dust, ashes, waste, want, ruin, despair, madness, death, cunning, folly, words, wigs, rags, sheepskin, plunder, precedent, jargon, gammon, and spinach."
The poor soul kissed me with the most troubled look I had ever seen in her and went her way. Her manner of running over the names of her birds as if she were afraid of hearing them even from her own lips quite chilled me. This was not a cheering preparation for my visit, and I could have dispensed with the company of Mr. Vholes when Richard, who arrived within a minute or two after me, brought him to share our dinner. Although it was a very plain one, Ada and Richard were for some minutes both out of the room, together, helping to get ready what we were to eat and drink. Mr. Vholes took that opportunity of holding a little conversation in a low voice with me. He came to the window where I was sitting and began upon Symond's Inn.
"A dull place, Miss Summerson, for a life that is not an official one,"
said Mr. Vholes, smearing the glass with his black glove to make it clearer for me. "There is not much to see here," said I.
"Nor to hear, miss,"
returned Mr. Vholes.
"A little music does occasionally stray in, but we are not musical in the law and soon eject it. I hope Mr. Jarndyce is as well as his friends could wish him."
I thanked Mr. Vholes and said he was quite well.
"I have not the pleasure to be admitted among the number of his friends myself,"
said Mr. Vholes.
and I am aware that the gentlemen of our profession are sometimes regarded in such quarters with an unfavourable eye. Our plain course, however, under good report and evil report and all kinds of prejudice, we are the victims of prejudice, is to have everything openly carried on. How do you find Mr. C. looking, Miss Summerson?"
"He looks very ill, dreadfully anxious."
"Just so,"
said Mr. Vholes. He stood behind me with his long black figure reaching nearly to the ceiling of those low rooms, feeling the pimples on his face as if they were ornaments, and speaking inwardly and evenly as though there were not a human passion or emotion in his nature.
"Mr. Woodcourt is in attendance upon Mr. C., I believe?"
he resumed. "Mr. Woodcourt is his disinterested friend," I answered.
"But I mean in professional attendance, medical attendance."
"That can do little for an unhappy mind," said I.
"Just so,"
said Mr. Vholes. So slow, so eager, so bloodless and gaunt, I felt as if Richard were wasting away beneath the eyes of this adviser, and there was something of the vampire in him.
"Miss Summerson,"
said Mr. Vholes, very slowly rubbing his gloved hands, as if, to his cold sense of touch, they were much the same in black kid or out of it.
"This was an ill-advised marriage of Mr. C.'s."
I begged he would excuse me from discussing it. They had been engaged, and they were both very young, I told him, a little indignantly, and when the prospect before them was much fairer and brighter, when Richard had not yielded himself to the unhappy influence which now darkened his life.
"Just so,"
assented Mr. Vholes again.
"Still, with a view to everything being openly carried on, I will, with your permission, Miss Summerson, observe to you that I consider this a very ill-advised marriage indeed. I owe the opinion not only to Mr. C.'s connections, against whom I should naturally wish to protect myself, but also to my own reputation, dear to myself as a professional man aiming to keep respectable, dear to my 3 girls at home for whom I am striving to realize some little independence, dear, I will even say, to my aged father whom it is my privilege to support."
"It would become a very different marriage, a much happier and better marriage, another marriage altogether, Mr. Vholes," said I, "if Richard were persuaded to turn his back on the fatal pursuit in which you are engaged with him." Mr. Vholes, with a noiseless cough, or rather gasp, into one of his black gloves, inclined his head as if he did not wholly dispute even that.
"Miss Summerson,"
he said,
"it may be so, and I freely admit that the young lady who has taken Mr. C.'s name upon herself in so ill-advised a manner, you will, I am sure, not quarrel with me for throwing out that remark again as a duty I owe to Mr. C.'s connections, is a highly genteel young lady. Business has prevented me from mixing much with general society in any but a professional character. Still, I trust I am competent to perceive that she is a highly genteel young lady. As to beauty, I am not a judge of that myself, and I never did give much attention to it from a boy, but I dare say the young lady is equally eligible in that point of view. She is considered, so I have heard, among the clerks in the inn, and it is a point more in their way than in mine. In reference to Mr. C.'s pursuit of his interests—"
"Oh, his interests, Mr. Vholes?"
"Pardon me,"
returned Mr. Vholes, going on in exactly the same inward and dispassionate manner.
"Mr. C. takes certain interests under certain wills disputed in the suit. It is a term we use. In reference to Mr. C.'s pursuit of his interests, I mentioned to you, Miss Summerson, the first time I had the pleasure of seeing you, in my desire that everything should be openly carried on. I used those words, for I happened afterwards to note them in my diary, which is producible at any time. I mentioned to you that Mr. C. had laid down the principle of watching his own interests, and that when a client of mine laid down a principle which was not of an immoral, that is to say, unlawful nature, it devolved upon me to carry it out. I have carried it out. I do carry it out, but I will not smooth things over to any connexion of Mr. C.'s on any account. As open as I was to Mr. Jarndyce, I am to you. I regard in the light of a professional duty to be so, though it can be charged to no one. I openly say, unpalatable as it may be, that I consider Mr. C.'s affairs in a very bad way, that I consider Mr. C. himself in a very bad way, and that I regard this as an exceedingly ill-advised marriage. Am I here, sir? Yes, I thank you. I am here, Mr. C., and enjoying the pleasure of some agreeable conversation with Miss Summerson, for which I have to thank you very much, sir." He broke off thus in answer to Richard, who addressed him as he came into the room.
By this time I too well understood Mr. Vholes's scrupulous way of saving himself and his respectability not to feel that our worst fears did but keep pace with his client's progress. We sat down to dinner, and I had an opportunity of observing Richard anxiously. I was not disturbed by Mr. Vholes, who took off his gloves to dine, though he sat opposite to me at the small table, for I doubt if, looking up at all, he once removed his eyes from his host's face. I found Richard thin and languid, slovenly in his dress, abstracted in his manner, forcing his spirits now and then, and at other intervals relapsing into a dull thoughtfulness. About his large bright eyes, that used to be so merry, there was a wanness and a restlessness that changed them altogether. I cannot use the expression that he looked old. There is a ruin of youth which is not like age, and into such a ruin Richard's youth and youthful beauty had all fallen away. He ate little and seemed indifferent what it was, showed himself to be much more impatient than he used to be, and was quick even with Ada. I thought at first that his old light-hearted manner was all gone, but it shone out of him sometimes, as I had occasionally known little momentary glimpses of my own old face to look out upon me from the glass. His laugh had not quite left him either, but it was like the echo of a joyful sound, and that is always sorrowful. Yet he was as glad as ever, in his old affectionate way, to have me there, and we talked of the old times pleasantly. These did not appear to be interesting to Mr. Vholes, though he occasionally made a gasp, which I believe was his smile. He rose shortly after dinner and said that with the permission of the ladies he would retire to his office.
"Always devoted to business, Mr. Vholes!"
cried Richard.
"Yes, Mr. C.," he returned. "The interest of clients are never to be neglected, sir. They are paramount in the thoughts of a professional man like myself who wishes to preserve a good name among his fellow practitioners and society at large. My denying myself the pleasure of the present agreeable conversation may not be wholly irrespective of your own interests, Mr. C." Richard expressed himself quite sure of that and lighted Mr. Vholes out. On his return he told us more than once that Vholes was a good fellow, a safe fellow, a man who did what he pretended to do, a very good fellow indeed. He was so defiant about it that it struck me he had begun to doubt Mr. Vholes. Then he threw himself on the sofa, tired out, and Ada and I put things to rights, for they had no other servant than the woman who attended to the chambers. My dear girl had a cottage piano there, and quietly sat down to sing some of Richard's favourites, the lamp being first removed into the next room as he complained of its hurting his eyes. I sat between them at my dear girl's side and felt very melancholy listening to her sweet voice. I think Richard did too. I think he darkened the room for that reason. She had been singing some time, rising between whiles to bend over him and speak to him, when Mr. Woodcourt came in. Then he sat down by Richard, and half playfully, half earnestly, quite naturally and easily, found out how he felt and where he had been all day. Presently he proposed to accompany him in a short walk on one of the bridges, as it was a moonlight airy night, and Richard readily consenting, they went out together. They left my dear girl still sitting at the piano and me still sitting beside her. When they were gone out, I drew my arm round her waist. She put her left hand in mine, I was sitting on that side, but kept her right upon the keys, going over and over them without striking any note. "Esther, my dearest," she said, breaking silence, "Richard is never so well, and I am never so easy about him as when he is with Allan Woodcourt. We have to thank you for that." I pointed out to my darling how this could scarcely be, because Mr. Woodcourt had come to her cousin John's house and had known us all there, and because he had always liked Richard, and Richard had always liked him, and so forth. "All true," said Ada, "but that he is such a devoted friend to us, we owe to you." I thought it best to let my dear girl have her way and to say no more about it. So I said as much. I said it lightly, because I felt her trembling. "Esther, my dearest, I want to be a good wife, a very, very good wife indeed. You shall teach me." "I teach?" I said no more,
for I noticed the hand that was fluttering over the keys, and I knew that it was not I who ought to speak, that it was she who had something to say to me. When I married Richard, I was not insensible to what was before him. I had been perfectly happy for a long time with you, and I had never known any trouble or anxiety, so loved and cared for, but I understood the danger he was in, dear Esther. I know, my darling. When we were married, I had some little hope that I might be able to convince him of his mistake, that he might come to regard it in a new way as my husband and not pursue it all the more desperately for my sake, as he does. But if I had not had that hope, I would have married him just the same, Esther, just the same. In the momentary firmness of the hand that was never still, a firmness inspired by the utterance of these last words and dying away with them, I saw the confirmation of her earnest tones. You are not to think, my dearest Esther, that I fail to see what you see and fear what you fear. No one can understand him better than I do. The greatest wisdom that ever lived in the world could scarcely know Richard better than my love does. She spoke so modestly and softly, and her trembling hand expressed such agitation as it moved to and fro upon the silent notes. My dear, dear girl! I see him at his worst every day. I watch him in his sleep. I know every change of his face. But when I married Richard, I was quite determined, Esther, if heaven would help me, never to show him that I grieved for what he did, and so to make him more unhappy. I want him, when he comes home, to find no trouble in my face. I want him, when he looks at me, to see what he loved in me. I married him to do this, and this supports me. I felt her trembling more. I waited for what was yet to come, and I now thought I began to know what it was. And something else supports me, Esther. She stopped a minute, stopped speaking only. Her hand was still in motion. I look forward a little while, and I don't know what great aid may come to me. When Richard turns his eyes upon me then, there may be something lying on my breast, more eloquent than I have been, with greater power than mine, to show him his true course and win him back. Her hand stopped now. She clasped me in her arms, and I clasped her in mine. If that little creature should fail too, Esther, I still look forward. I look forward a long while, through years and years, and think that then, when I am growing old, or when I am dead perhaps, a beautiful woman, his daughter, happily married, may be proud of him and a blessing to him, or that a generous brave man, as handsome as he used to be, as hopeful and far more happy, may walk in the sunshine with him, honouring his grey head and saying to himself, I thank God this is my father, ruined by a fatal inheritance and restored through me. Oh, my sweet girl, what a heart was that which beat so fast against me! These hopes uphold me, my dear Esther, and I know they will, though sometimes even they depart from me before a dread that arises when I look at Richard. I tried to cheer my darling and ask her what it was. Sobbing and weeping, she replied, that he may not live to see his child. End of chapter 60. Chapter 61 of Bleak House. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. Bleak House,
by Charles Dickens. Chapter 61. A Discovery.
The days when I frequented that miserable corner, which my dear girl brightened, can never fade in my remembrance. I never see it, and I never wish to see it now. I have been there only once since, but in my memory there is a mournful glory shining on the place, which will shine for ever. Not a day passed without my going there, of course. At first I found Mr. Skimpole there, on 2 or 3 occasions, idly playing the piano and talking in his usual vivacious strain. Now, besides my very much mistrusting the probability of his being there without making Richard poorer, I felt as if there was something in his careless gaiety too inconsistent with what I knew of the depths of Ada's life. I clearly perceived, too, that Ada shared my feelings. I therefore resolved, after much thinking of it, to make a private visit to Mr. Skimpole and try delicately to explain myself. My dear girl was the great consideration that made me bold. I set off one morning, accompanied by Charley, for Somers Town. As I approached the house, I was strongly inclined to turn back, for I felt what a desperate attempt it was to make an impression on Mr. Skimpole, and how extremely likely it was that he would signally defeat me. However, I thought that being there, I would go through with it. I knocked with a trembling hand at Mr. Skimpole's door, literally with a hand, for the knocker was gone, and after a long parley gained admission from an Irishwoman who was in the area when I knocked, breaking up the lid of a water-butt with a poker to light the fire with. Mr. Skimpole, lying on the sofa in his room, playing the flute a little, was enchanted to see me.
"Now, who should receive me?" he asked. "Who would I prefer for mistress of the ceremonies? Would I have his comedy daughter, his beauty daughter, or his sentiment daughter? Or would I have all the daughters at once in a perfect nosegay?"
I replied, half defeated already, that I wished to speak to himself only if he would give me leave.
"My dear Miss Summerson, most joyfully, of course,"
he said, bringing his chair nearer mine and breaking into his fascinating smile.
"Of course it's not business. Then it's pleasure."
I said it certainly was not business that I came upon, but it was not quite a pleasant matter.
"Then, my dear Miss Summerson,"
said he with the frankest gaiety,
"don't allude to it. Why should you allude to anything that is not a pleasant matter? I never do. And you are a much pleasanter creature in every point of view than I. You are perfectly pleasant. I am imperfectly pleasant. Then, if I never allude to an unpleasant matter, how much less should you? So that's disposed of, and we'll talk of something else."
Although I was embarrassed, I took courage to intimate that I still wished to pursue the subject.
"I should think it a mistake,"
said Mr. Skimpole with his airy laugh,
"if I thought Miss Summerson capable of making one, but I don't."
"Mr. Skimpole," said I, raising my eyes to his, "I have so often heard you say that you are unacquainted with the common affairs of life."
"Meaning our 3 banking-house friends, L.S., and who's the junior partner? D,"
said Mr. Skimpole brightly.
"Not an idea of them."
"That perhaps," I went on, "you will excuse my boldness on that account. I think you ought most seriously to know that Richard is poorer than he was."
"Dear me,"
said Mr. Skimpole.
"So am I, they tell me."
"And in very embarrassed circumstances."
"Parallel case exactly,"
said Mr. Skimpole with a delighted countenance. This at present naturally causes Ada much secret anxiety, and as I think she is less anxious when no claims are made upon her by visitors, and as Richard has one uneasiness always heavy on his mind, it has occurred to me to take the liberty of saying that if you would not. I was coming to the point with great difficulty when he took me by both hands and with a radiant face and in the liveliest way anticipated it.
"Not go there? Certainly not, my dear Miss Summerson, most assuredly not. Why should I go there? When I go anywhere, I go for pleasure. I don't go anywhere for pain, because I was made for pleasure. Pain comes to me when it wants me. Now, I have had very little pleasure at our dear Richard's lately, and your practical sagacity demonstrates why. Our young friends, losing the youthful poetry which was once so captivating in them, begin to think, this is a man who wants pounds. So I am. I always want pounds, not for myself, but because tradespeople always want them of me. Next, our young friends begin to think, becoming mercenary, this is the man who had pounds, who borrowed them, which I did. I always borrow pounds. So our young friends, reduced to prose, which is much to be regretted, degenerate in their power of imparting pleasure to me. Why should I go to see them, therefore? Absurd!"
Through the beaming smile with which he regarded me as he reasoned thus, there now broke forth a look of disinterested benevolence, quite astonishing.
"Besides,"
he said, pursuing his argument in his tone of light-hearted conviction,
"if I don't go anywhere for pain, which would be a perversion of the intention of my being and a monstrous thing to do, why should I go anywhere to be the cause of pain? If I went to see our young friends in their present ill-regulated state of mind, I should give them pain. The associations with me would be disagreeable. They might say, this is the man who had pounds and who can't pay pounds, which I can't, of course. Nothing could be more out of the question. Then kindness requires that I shouldn't go near them, and I won't."
He finished by genially kissing my hand and thanking me. Nothing but Miss Summerson's fine tact, he said, would have found this out for him. I was much disconcerted, but I reflected that if the main point were gained, it mattered little how strangely he perverted everything leading to it. I had determined to mention something else, however, and I thought I was not to be put off in that. "Mr. Skimpole," said I must take the liberty of saying before I conclude my visit that I was much surprised to learn, on the best authority some little time ago, that you knew with whom that poor boy left Bleak House and that you accepted a present on that occasion. I have not mentioned it to my guardian, for I fear it would hurt him unnecessarily, but I may say to you that I was much surprised."
"No? Really surprised, my dear Miss Summerson?"
he returned inquiringly, raising his pleasant eyebrows. "Greatly surprised." He thought about it for a little while, with a highly agreeable and whimsical expression of face, then quite gave it up, and said in his most engaging manner,
"You know what a child I am. Why surprised?"
I was reluctant to enter minutely into that question, but as he begged I would, for he was really curious to know, I gave him to understand in the gentlest words I could use that his conduct seemed to involve a disregard of several moral obligations. He was much amused and interested when he heard this, and said, "No, really?" with ingenuous simplicity. "You know I don't intend to be responsible. I never could do it. Responsibility is a thing that has always been above me, or below me," said Mr. Skimpole. "I don't even know which. But as I understand the way in which my dear Miss Summerson, always remarkable for her practical good sense and clearness, puts this case, I should imagine it was chiefly a question of money. Do you know?" I incautiously gave a qualified assent to this. "Ah, then you see," said Mr. Skimpole, shaking his head, "I am hopeless of understanding it." I suggested, as I rose to go, that it was not right to betray my guardian's confidence for a bribe.
"My dear Miss Summerson,"
he returned with a candid hilarity that was all his own,
"I can't be bribed."
"Not by Mr. Bucket," said I.
"No,"
said he,
"not by anybody. I don't attach any value to money. I don't care about it. I don't know about it. I don't want it. I don't keep it. It goes away from me directly. How can I be bribed?"
I showed that I was of a different opinion, though I had not the capacity for arguing the question.
"On the contrary,"
said Mr. Skimpole,
"I am exactly the man to be placed in a superior position in such a case as that. I am above the rest of mankind in such a case as that. I can act with philosophy in such a case as that. I am not warped by prejudices as an Italian baby is by bandages. I am as free as the air. I feel myself as far above suspicion as Caesar's wife."
Anything to equal the lightness of his manner and the playful impartiality with which he seemed to convince himself as he tossed the matter about like a ball of feathers was surely never seen in anybody else.
"Observe the case, my dear Miss Summerson. Here is a boy received into the house and put to bed in a state that I strongly object to. The boy being in bed, a man arrives like the house that Jack built. Here is the man who demands the boy who is received into the house and put to bed in a state that I strongly object to. Here is a bank-note produced by the man who demands the boy who is received into the house and put to bed in a state that I strongly object to. Here is the Skimpole who accepts the bank-note produced by the man who demands the boy who is received into the house and put to bed in a state that I strongly object to. Those are the facts. Very well. Should the Skimpole have refused the note? Why should the Skimpole have refused the note? Skimpole protests to Bucket, "What's this for? I don't understand it. It is of no use to me. Take it away." Bucket still entreats Skimpole to accept it. Are there reasons why Skimpole, not being warped by prejudices, should accept it? Yes, Skimpole perceives them. What are they? Skimpole reasons with himself, this is a tamed lynx, an active police officer, an intelligent man, a person of a peculiarly directed energy and great subtlety, both of conception and execution, who discovers our friends and enemies for us when they run away, recovers our property for us when we are robbed, avenges us comfortably when we are murdered. This active police officer and intelligent man has acquired, in the exercise of his art, a strong faith in money. He finds it very useful to him, and he makes it very useful to society. Shall I shake that faith in Bucket because I want it myself? Shall I deliberately blunt one of Bucket's weapons? Shall I positively paralyze Bucket in his next detective operation? And again, if it is blameable in Skimpole to take the note, it is blameable in Bucket to offer the note. Much more blameable in Bucket, because he is the knowing man. Now, Skimpole wishes to think well of Bucket. Skimpole deems it essential in its little place to the general cohesion of things that he should think well of Bucket. The state expressly asks him to trust Bucket. And he does, and that's all he does.
I had nothing to offer in reply to this exposition, and therefore took my leave. Mr. Skimpole, however, who was in excellent spirits, would not hear of my returning home attended only by little Coavinses, and accompanied me himself. He entertained me on the way with a variety of delightful conversation, and assured me, at parting, that he should never forget the fine tact with which I had found that out for him about our young friends. As it so happened that I never saw Mr. Skimpole again, I may at once finish what I know of his history. A coolness arose between him and my guardian, based principally on the foregoing grounds, and on his having heartlessly disregarded my guardian's entreaties, as we afterwards learnt from Ada, in reference to Richard. His being heavily in my guardian's debt had nothing to do with their separation. He died some 5 years afterwards, and left a diary behind him with letters and other materials towards his life, which was published, and which showed him to have been the victim of a combination on the part of mankind against an amiable child. It was considered very pleasant reading, but I never read more of it myself than the sentence on which I chanced to light on opening the book. It was this: Jarndyce, in common with most other men I have known, is the incarnation of selfishness. And now I come to a part of my story touching myself, very nearly indeed, and for which I was quite unprepared when the circumstances occurred. Whatever little lingerings may have now and then revived in my mind, associated with my poor old face, had only revived as belonging to a part of my life that was gone like my infancy or my childhood. I have suppressed none of my many weaknesses on that subject, but have written them as faithfully as my memory has recalled them, and I hope to do, and mean to do, the same down to the last word of these pages, which I see now not so very far before me. The months were gliding away, and my dear girl, sustained by the hopes she had confided in me, was the same beautiful star in the miserable corner. Richard, more worn and haggard, haunted the court day after day, listlessly sat there the whole day long when he knew there was no remote chance of the suit being mentioned, and became one of the stock sights of the place. I wonder whether any of the gentlemen remembered him as he was when he first went there. So completely was he absorbed in his fixed idea that he used to avow in his cheerful moments that he should never have breathed the fresh air now but for Woodcourt. It was only Mr. Woodcourt who could occasionally divert his attention for a few hours at a time and rouse him, even when he sunk into a lethargy of mind and body that alarmed us greatly, and the returns of which became more frequent as the months went on. My dear girl was right in saying that he only pursued his errors the more desperately for her sake. I have no doubt that his desire to retrieve what he had lost was rendered the more intense by his grief for his young wife, and became like the madness of a gamester. I was there, as I have mentioned, at all hours. When I was there at night, I generally went home with Charley in a coach. Sometimes my guardian would meet me in the neighbourhood, and we would walk home together. One evening he had arranged to meet me at 8 o'clock. I could not leave, as I usually did, quite punctually at that time, for I was working for my dear girl and had a few stitches more to do to finish what I was about. But it was within a few minutes of the hour when I bundled up my little work-basket, gave my darling my last kiss for the night, and hurried downstairs. Mr. Woodcourt went with me, as it was dusk. When we came to the usual place of meeting, it was close by, and Mr. Woodcourt had often accompanied me before. My guardian was not there. We waited half an hour, walking up and down, but there were no signs of him. We agreed that he was either prevented from coming or that he had come and gone away, and Mr. Woodcourt proposed to walk home with me. It was the first walk we had ever taken together, except that very short one to the usual place of meeting. We spoke of Richard and Ada the whole way. I did not thank him in words for what he had done. My appreciation of it had risen above all words then, but I hoped he might not be without some understanding of what I felt so strongly. Arriving at home and going upstairs, we found that my guardian was out and that Mrs. Woodcourt was out too. We were in the very same room into which I had brought my blushing girl when her youthful lover, now her so altered husband, was the choice of her young heart, the very same room from which my guardian and I had watched them going away through the sunlight in the fresh bloom of their hope and promise. We were standing by the opened window looking down into the street when Mr. Woodcourt spoke to me. I learnt in a moment that he loved me. I learned in a moment that my scarred face was all unchanged to him. I learned in a moment that what I had thought was pity and compassion was devoted, generous, faithful love. Oh, too late to know it now! Too late! Too late! That was the first ungrateful thought I had. Too late!
When I returned,
he told me,
when I came back, no richer than when I went away, and found you newly risen from a sick bed, yet so inspired by sweet consideration for others, and so free from a selfish thought.
"Oh, Mr. Woodcourt, forbear, forbear!" I entreated him. "I do not deserve your high praise. I had many selfish thoughts at that time, many."
"Heaven knows, beloved of my life," said he, "that my praise is not a lover's praise, but the truth. You do not know what all around you see in Esther Summerson, how many hearts she touches and awakens, what sacred admiration, and what love she wins."
"Oh, Mr. Woodcourt," cried I, "it is a great thing to win love. It is a great thing to win love. I am proud of it and honoured by it, and the hearing of it causes me to shed these tears of mingled joy and sorrow. Joy that I have won it, sorrow that I have not deserved it better. But I am not free to think of yours." I said it with a stronger heart, for when he praised me thus, and when I heard his voice thrill with his belief that what he said was true, I aspired to be more worthy of it. It was not too late for that. Although I closed this unforeseen page in my life to-night, I could be worthier of it all through my life. And it was a comfort to me, and an impulse to me, and I felt a dignity rise up within me that was derived from him when I thought so. He broke the silence.
"I should poorly show the trust that I have in the dear one who will ever more be as dear to me as now."
And the deep earnestness with which he said it at once strengthened me and made me weep.
"If, after her assurance that she is not free to think of my love, I urged it. Dear Esther, let me only tell you that the fond idea of you, which I took abroad, was exalted to the heavens when I came home. I have always hoped, in the first hour when I seemed to stand in any ray of good fortune, to tell you this. I have always feared that I should tell it you in vain. My hopes and fears are both fulfilled to-night. I distress you. I have said enough."
Something seemed to pass into my place that was like the angel he thought me, and I felt so sorrowful for the loss he had sustained. I wished to help him in his trouble, as I had wished to do when he showed that first commiseration for me. "Dear Mr. Woodcourt," said I, "before we part to-night, something is left for me to say. I never could say it as I wish. I never shall. But I had to think again of being more deserving of his love and his affliction before I could go on. I am deeply sensible of your generosity, and I shall treasure its remembrance to my dying hour. I know full well how changed I am. I know you are not unacquainted with my history, and I know what a noble love that is which is so faithful. What you have said to me could have affected me so much from no other lips, for there are none that could give it such a value to me. It shall not be lost. It shall make me better." He covered his eyes with his hand and turned away his head. How could I ever be worthy of those tears? If, in the unchanged intercourse we shall have together, intending Richard and Ada, and I hope in many happier scenes of life, you ever find anything in me which you can honestly think is better than it used to be, believe that it will have sprung up from to-night, and that I shall owe it to you. And never believe, dear, dear Mr. Woodcourt, never believe that I forget this night, or that while my heart beats it can be insensible to the pride and joy of having been beloved by you." He took my hand and kissed it. He was like himself again, and I felt still more encouraged. "I am induced by what you said just now," said I, "to hope that you have succeeded in your endeavour."
"I have,"
he answered.
"With such help from Mr. Jarndyce as you, who know him so well, can imagine him to have rendered me, I have succeeded."
"Heaven bless him for it," said I, giving him my hand, "and heaven bless you in all you do."
"I shall do it better for the wish," he answered. "It will make me enter on these new duties as on another sacred trust from you."
"Ah, Richard," I exclaimed involuntarily, "what will he do when you are gone?"
"I am not required to go yet. I would not desert him, dear Miss Summerson, even if I were." One other thing I felt it needful to touch upon before he left me. I knew that I should not be worthier of the love I could not take if I reserved it. "Mr. Woodcourt," said I, "you will be glad to know from my lips, before I say good night, that in the future, which is clear and bright before me, I am most happy, most fortunate, have nothing to regret or desire." It was indeed a glad hearing to him, he replied. "From my childhood I have been," said I, "the object of the untiring goodness of the best of human beings, to whom I am so bound by every tie of attachment, gratitude, and love, that nothing I could do in the compass of a life could express the feelings of a single day." "I share those feelings," he returned. "You speak of Mr. Jarndyce." "You know his virtues well," said I, "but few can know the greatness of his character as I know it. All its highest and best qualities have been revealed to me, in nothing more brightly than in the shaping out of that future in which I am so happy. And if your highest homage and respect had not been his already, which I know they are, they would have been his, I think, on this assurance, and in the feeling it would have awakened in you towards him for my sake." He fervently replied that indeed, indeed, they would have been. I gave him my hand again. "Good night," I said. "Good-bye." "The first, until we meet to-morrow. The second, as a farewell to this theme between us for ever."
"Yes."
"Good night. Good-bye."
He left me, and I stood at the dark window watching the street. His love, in all its constancy and generosity, had come so suddenly upon me that he had not left me a minute when my fortitude gave way again and the street was blotted out by my rushing tears. But they were not tears of regret and sorrow. No, he had called me the beloved of his life and had said I would be evermore as dear to him as I was then, and I felt as if my heart would not hold the triumph of having heard those words. My first wild thought had died away. It was not too late to hear them, for it was not too late to be animated by them, to be good, true, grateful, and contented. How easy my path! How much easier than his!
End of chapter 61.